Hello and welcome. The MP Evans Group plc supplies certified sustainable palm oil to product manufacturers worldwide. The business has an illustrious history, it ticks all the boxes with respect to ESG, and through hard work and innovation, it is thoroughly deserving of its impressive market valuation. So, we're pretty excited that today our guest castaway is Peter Hadsley-Chaplin, the current non-executive chairman and former CEO of the company. To find out how Peter has influenced the success of MP Evans during his 37-year tenure, and for a glimpse into the workings of the MP Evans board, stay tuned to Mark's exclusive interview. In this, episode 38 of The Desert Island Investor. This episode of the podcast is generously hosted by Progressive Equity Research. Visit their website at progressive-research.com.
The year was 1989. That was the year that the Berlin Wall fell. There were revolutions across Eastern Europe, protests in Tiananmen Square. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. But most notably, our guest castaway, Peter Hadsley-Chaplin, joined the board of MP Evans, where he still serves today in the capacity of non-executive chairman. Being a travelling salesman, I've probably spent more time than most in boardrooms, having meetings and doing presentations. But until this very month, I'd never been on a board or attended a board meeting, and hopefully Peter can give us an insight into the workings of boards, and that will not just be relevant to MP Evans, but a read across to other businesses. Not only does Peter's length of service make him an authority to speak on the subject, but over the years he has served as CEO, interestingly joint CEO, executive chairman, and now non-exec chair. Peter is putting it to shame, looking very dapper in his blazer in Panama. We're delighted that you've agreed to join us. Welcome to the island, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Peter, I said that you joined the board of MP Evans in 1989. Was it actually MP Evans or another slight incarnation back then?
It was a very different incarnation than Mark. In fact, it wasn't even called MP Evans at that particular time. For some 24 years during the course of its 150-year-long history, it traded under the name of Rowe Evans Investments plc, which some of our longer-standing shareholders may recall. But not only did I join the board of Rowe Evans in 1989, but importantly, I joined the board of 5 other listed plantation companies. And each of those companies had been around since actually the early 1900s, each owning at least one plantation in Malaysia or Indonesia. And crucially, each of those companies, including Rowe Evans, owning shares in each other. And this was the result of my father having put together what was described in those days as a cross-holding structure, which was a means of defending against takeover on the cheap, which was happening to a significant extent in the 70s and 80s, in particular, the era of the so-called Dawn Raid. And by having companies who cross-invested protected in this way, it helped to protect against predatory attack. And my father was the sort of spider at the center of the web. He was chairman of each of those companies, and I joined the board of each of those companies, which owned and operated plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia, and had some interests in Australia as well at that time.
Well, that's a tangled history. I mean, I'm looking at this morning at the market cap, which is nicely just 700. They're always bouncing all over the place, but it's 704 million for MP Evans, and the dividend is currently 52.5 pence. Looking back to when you started, can you give us an idea of how that compares to what you inherited?
Well, I believe that Rowe Evans Investments would have had a market cap of probably around 25 million in those days. And I believe we were paying a dividend of around 2 pence annually per share. And of course, we are keen to point out to our investors and would-be investors that not once in the course of the last 35 years have we lowered that dividend. It's either been maintained or increased over that period.
Oh, well, I'll have to take some time out later to work out the compound annual growth rate of that. But, there was a life prior to MP Evans, and you told me at the last AGM that you had a spell selling encyclopedias door to door. So I'd expect that made a man of you. But before joining the company in 1988, you worked as a commodity broker, and it was a different commodity to palm oil. What was it?
Well, in short, it was energy futures. But just reflecting for a moment on my short and extremely undistinguished career as a door-to-door encyclopedia salesman, it did at least prepare me for the sharper end of marketing before I then applied to and was accepted by one of London's leading commodity brokers at that time, a company called Zarnico. They, together with ED&F Man, were the biggest sugar broker, but they traded and broked all the soft commodity markets, such as, apart from sugar, cocoa, coffee, rubber, palm oil, tallow. And as a graduate trainee, I spent a bit of time being shunted around the different departments, learning about the different commodities. But then the International Petroleum Exchange opened, and the contract it traded initially was gas oil futures. So I joined the oil futures desk. In fact, my line manager at the time was a certain Christopher Bellew, who has been a very long time. I think he's been an investor in MP Evans, or Rowe Evans as it was then, for some 40 years, and a great proponent of the company. But I spent 3 years in the London office of Zarnico, working as a desk broker, and then 5 years in New York, trading on the New York Mercantile Exchange with similar contracts. There was a crude oil, an aviation kerosene, and a heating oil futures contract, and helping clients to trade onto those futures markets. So a very different sort of commodity, petroleum, compared with palm oil, but it did teach me a lot about the way in which markets move, how they can fluctuate wildly, as the oil market certainly did in the 1980s, and how investors can get caught short, and about the critical and important difference between genuine hedging and effectively gambling, speculating. And I have to say, some of our clients didn't quite always properly recognize the difference between the two and got their fingers badly burnt. But it's a lesson I've taken away with me to my time at over the years at MP Evans, and always made sure that we've been very prudent in our approach to selling our commodities, and used futures markets in a careful way where appropriate.
Well, some early lessons learned there. It's got a rich history, this business, and your father was involved with it from 1947. Were you always destined to join the company?
No, I absolutely wasn't. The company, well, it was originally a partnership that had been formed by the great Matthew Pennyfather Evans in the 1870s. It had then become a limited liability company, where it was not only an importer of tea and rubber, but also an investor in fellow plantation companies. And my father joined in 1947. It was a company sort of fell into soon after the end of the war, where he'd served as an officer in the Royal Engineers. And he sort of wanted to join a company where he could potentially become a biggish fish in a smallish pond, which he very much did over the 50 years or so that he worked for the company. And he on behalf of the family, acquired a significant shareholding, but it was never anything remotely resembling a controlling interest. And I certainly never assumed that I would follow in his footsteps, but rather that I would follow an alternative career. But perhaps I was being somewhat naive, because in the end, not only was my brother-in-law, a chartered accountant, persuaded of the merits of joining the group in 1982, but when I was slightly tiring of commodity broking and I was looking at the possibility of taking an MBA, my father caught me at that slightly vulnerable moment and said that MP Evans, he'd spoken to his co-directors and they were looking to hire another executive to work alongside Philip, and they would sponsor me, the company would sponsor me to take the MBA as long as I remained with the company for a period of 2 years. Well, 37 years later, I think that cost has been reasonably well depreciated.
Yeah, good point. So, did you serve on the board alongside your father? And if so, is there any advice that you can give to managing this relationship?
I did, absolutely, for several years, probably best part of a decade. And of course, I served on the board not just of Rowe Evans, but of all those other listed plantation companies. So there were an awful lot of board meetings. And it was a privilege and a joy in many ways to serve alongside my father. I mean, he was so enthusiastic about the business. He absolutely loved it. He loved everything about it. He loved the people, whether it was the UK team or whether it was the people on the ground in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Australia. He adored his visits there, and my mother enjoyed the visits too, and she did her share of bumping around on the back of Land Rovers, and actually the accommodation on the plantations was fairly rough and ready in those days. So it was a great joy in many ways, but there were also challenges. Inevitably, there's the young versus the older generation, and my father had, as I mentioned, he was the architect of this structure, which he felt was absolutely quintessential to the future, the ongoing safety and security of the group. For me, and indeed, I think for Philip, my brother-in-law, it was perhaps a touch dull. I mean, there were some things, there were some new activities, investments that we were looking at, but in many ways, we were just looking after small individual plantations from afar and investments in the other companies. And we increasingly felt, as I have to say, did a number of our advisors and indeed co-directors, that the structure as it was simply not going to be tenable in the longer term. And so I guess there were slight tensions where my father saw this as almost his lifetime's work of creating this structure, where we felt, Philip and I, that at the very least it should be simplified. And in the end, my father did see the merits of that. And I remember very touchingly after he'd retired in probably the early 2000s, where we amalgamated 4 of the listed companies, which were basically the Malaysian orientated ones, into one single company under the roof of Bertam Holdings, so that there were 3 separate companies with their core activity being respectively under Bertam was Malaysian rubber and palm oil, under Rowe Evans was Indonesian palm oil and a bit of rubber, and Lendu Holdings was Australia, cotton and cattle. But I remember that when he attended as a shareholder, having retired, the merger of those 4 companies, him holding up his ballot paper in support of the resolutions, it was a very touching moment, because I knew how instinctively it probably did go against his earlier instincts, but he nonetheless supported it. and did increasingly see that it did make sense to be more simplified, even if he had concerns about the safety, if you like, of the group and being protected against takeover.
Yeah, it can be difficult, these things, to navigate.
Yeah.
I mentioned, in your career that at one time you were a joint CEO, and it's not unique, but it's certainly a rarity. Did this present any problems? And what were the benefits of this tight family dynamic, and were there issues to manage as a result of it?
Yes, I had a variety of roles. I think in the early stages, I was actually chief executive, or we called ourselves managing directors in those days, of 5 of the listed companies, whilst Philip was managing director of Rowe Evans, and my father was chairman of them all. And then when we effected the merger, leaving us with 3 listed companies, I believe that Philip was chairman of Rowe Evans. I was chairman of the other 2. And then ultimately, when we went for the, if you like, big push and merged everything together, then that was the only time when we were formally, Philip and I, joint managing director. He was also CFO or finance director, as he called himself in those days. But I suppose the sort of bottom line is that we worked very, very well collaboratively together. We both had different strengths and different areas where we weren't so strong. And I think we complemented each other in the way we worked. And I remember very, very notably when we were literally flying on a plane between Brisbane and Singapore. And during the course of that flight, we mapped out on, I think, a couple of sides of A4 the future strategy of the group, including the merger into one vehicle, the sale of all the Malaysian estates, which have been in the business for 100 years or so, the planned expansion of 50 or 60,000 hectares using the proceeds from the sale of the Malaysian estates to expand into the sustainable palm oil Indonesian sector, and that we would end up probably with 6 or 7 mills, and that by the end of that sort of period of perhaps 15 years plus, the group might be producing in the order of 400,000 tons of crude palm oil. And that is essentially what we have now achieved. So we have seen it through, but I'll never forget that particular flight and how well we worked together as a team. But of course, when you are working with, whether it was my father, whether it was with my brother-in-law, and potentially to work with a brother-in-law and your father, that's quite an explosive mix. But generally, it worked very well. Occasionally, of course, there would be differences and slight tensions, and occasionally it might carry over into the family, which is unfortunate. But generally speaking, we all managed it well and it emerged well, if you like, on the other side.
Well, I'd be interested if those 2 sheets of A4 paper are still in existence somewhere. But more recently, you've moved from exec to non-exec chair. And in this transition, what typical duties have you dispensed with? On who do these now fall?
Well, it's been a very, very gradual transition. When in 2010, we decided on a slightly different structure, board-wise, if you like, or executive board-wise, where Philip was the full-time managing director, and I was ready and willing at that point to step back to a part-time executive role. So I took on the role at that stage of executive chair. So I worked 3 days a week for the subsequent 10 years or so. And then in due course, I stepped back to just 2 days a week. And then more recently, I've moved from my, as you say, executive chair role to one of non-executive chair. But even as executive, my duties had gone down and down, and it was more about being in the mix in the office, chatting things through, making decisions collaboratively with my colleagues, with Matthew Coulson, our CEO, with Luke Shaw, our CFO. But it became increasingly clear that really it was no longer necessary to have me there in an executive capacity, but more to come in. I now come in once a week, and we still bounce things off each other, but I'm not quite so, if you like, operationally involved. But it's been a relatively smooth and seamless transition. You may have to ask them if they feel the same way about it.
Right. So it's very much been like a tapering process. But
it has, yeah.
Yeah, you've held various positions, and it's not uncommon for board members to take on a different role. But how much is it a balancing act? And again, what advice would you give regarding, on one hand, not interfering with the new office holder, but at the same time being prepared to lend your sage counsel?
I don't know how sage it is, but yes, of course, it can be a little delicate at times. But there's been something of a tradition in the group whereby, for instance, on 2 or 3 occasions, the CFO has moved on to become CEO. Philip, in fact, after stepping down as group managing director, remained on the board as a non-executive director. Chandra, who had been a executive director in recent years, then moved on to the role of non-executive director. And so Ravi Chandran is our new president director of our Indonesian operations. So there are always going to be slight delicacies, if you like, in the way these things are handled. But I think generally it's very good to have people with the experience of the industry. And I think that's one of the features of being based in the UK, when there are so few people who have, if you like, plantation company experience. And therefore, it's really good to get the best out of them, even when they've moved on from one role into another role. And I think we all understand that. And generally, it works well.
Yeah, again, so we've discussed your father's involvement, and since the formation of the business, it's shape-shifted over its long history, and it once had interest in tea and rubber. And during your time, you've redirected the business to a single commodity, sustainable palm oil, from a single country, Indonesia, and you exited, the cattle interests, for example, in Australia. How much is there a battle between head and heart, and not unique to family situations or many businesses, but where you're sometimes reversing what family members have previously established? And I would expect, moves such as this involve losing colleagues that you've formed close relationship with. And indeed, Australia, as an example, can be a very nice place to visit.
Yes, well, the sort of head and heart, if you like, just reflecting back on the dismantling of the cross-holding structure, which was so close to my father's heart. But in the end, and I'd like to think now, he didn't see the final merger when everything was put under one roof, but I'd like to think that he would heartily approve of what we have done. But that was a good example, if you like, head over heart. And similarly, the sale of the Malaysian plantations. Generally speaking, if you like, we found good homes. I mean, obviously, we sought to secure the best possible price. But in general, the plantations that we sold were sold to companies, or indeed large individual new owners, who took on the manager and the staff. And I understood the staff generally remained there working for their new owners. Australia wasn't quite such a wrench. I mean, it's true, I thoroughly enjoyed my visits there, although I was a bit relieved no longer to be visiting Brisbane 4 times a year. I mean, it's a lot of travel. But there we had largely sold down our interests, bar our investment in what was actually one of Australia's largest cattle companies. But there we were actually significant minority shareholders. We didn't control it. And the majority shareholders sold out at the same time as ourselves. And it was absolutely the right thing to do. But yes, it's not always been easy, but I've no doubt that those decisions have been the right ones.
Yeah. Redirect people back to the market capitalization that it is today, I would say. How easy or challenging was it to implement the new strategy, once it had been formed?
Well, inevitably, there were huge challenges in terms of what we were seeking to undertake. In those days, we didn't actually even manage our own Indonesian plantations. Strangely, although the plantation areas that we had were larger than in Malaysia, traditionally, over many years, we'd managed ourselves our Malaysian plantations, but the Indonesian plantations had been managed for the last 30 or so years by a fellow plantation company, in which we had a couple of co-investments as well, the CPEF Group, Belgian-based company. So initially, when we invested in the new areas of land to be part of the new strategy of growth, and those were the project on Bangka Island and in East Kalimantan, the Kota Bangun project, we did that with literally 3 or 4 people based in our new Jakarta office. David Wilkinson, who had been with us since 1999, initially managing our Malaysian plantations, and then very capably helping us to sell our Malaysian estates. And then he moved across to Indonesia on our behalf to set up the Jakarta office. There were literally 3 or 4 people in the office. We now are 100 strong. So there were all sorts of challenges, but with David's help, and then to David's enormous credit, he felt that he didn't want to spend a great number of years in Indonesia. He'd enjoyed the process, but he felt he and his family wanted to move back to Malaysia, where they've continued to help us. David has continued to help us over the years with various projects, both in Indonesia and Malaysia, not least in managing our the Bertam Properties town project, where he's on the board along with myself as a director. But he said to me that if there's one person, that if MP Evans was owned 100% by me, there's one person I would feel really comfortable taking over the management, and that's my old friend from Harrisons and Crossfields, Chandra Sekaran. And David helped persuade Chandra to come aboard and to help us to develop the business with all his contacts. Chandra had 15 years of experience with Harrisons and Crossfields, which later went on to become Golden Hoop Plantations, and then with a big Indonesian plantation company, Sinar Mas. And with all his connections and his experience, he brought in a fantastic team. And he's the first to say that it wouldn't have been without his a brilliant team that he helped to bring in, that we, without their support and help, we would not have developed and managed the group to the level that it's been. The operations and the projects that we have developed and acquired and improved, that we would never have done that without Chandra's fantastic help and those of his colleagues. And of course, Chandra has now handed the baton over to Ravi Chandran, Ravi as he's known.
Yeah, Ravi described it as trying to follow a legend, he said. So it's
Yes.
certainly some challenge for him. But this major redirection of the business aside, across your tenure, what have been the other major challenges?
I mean, the major challenge that comes to mind is one that's actually always been there, but one should never lightly discount it as a challenge. And that is the fact that here we are, based in Tunbridge Wells, 6 or 7 staff in the office. The only asset we own is the Tunbridge Wells office here. But everything else, all our operations and assets are some 7,000 miles away, 12,000 employees, and we are in charge of running a company where the business is on, almost the other side of the world. So always the big ongoing challenge is managing that effectively. And in order to do that, you have to have brilliant communications between the UK office and the Indonesian office. And no relationship, if you like, is as important as that between our CEO, Matthew, and Ravi, the president director of PT Evans. And they are in very, very frequent contact. They're several times a week, and they have a weekly catch up to review everything. And I actually join that catch up once a month to keep my hand in as to what's going on as well. But you need to have absolute trust and confidence and faith. You can't micromanage. We're not plantation experts, but at the same time, we need to know what's going on, and we need to be able to make decisions, generally, of course, in conjunction with Ravi and his team. And Matthew's discussions won't be confined to talking to Ravi. For instance, as you know, Mark, he is absolutely passionate about anything connected with ESG, our environmental, our social, our governance responsibilities, in putting together the ESG reports, for instance. He will liaise closely, directly with the sustainability team in Jakarta and on other issues with some of the other heads. But it is a delicate balance and it needs to be managed carefully. And I feel we do it really, really well.
Okay, well, the board is a very small but important group of people. And what considerations do you put into place when bringing in fresh blood? Now, presumably, you'll want somebody who will work cohesively with the existing team, but nevertheless, you'll still want people that can challenge. And on one hand, you don't want a disruptive loose cannon, but you want to avoid groupthink. Now, Matthew Coulson, for example, is our CEO, but he was the CFO. And Luke Shaw's replaced Matthew as CFO. And I would expect that you'll be looking for somebody not cut from exactly the same cloth.
Absolutely. You need to have a really good mix of people, of personalities, of skill sets on the board, whether it's in finance, in agriculture. We've got 2 people who are absolute experts in palm oil, in the form of Chandra, and indeed our representative from KLK, our major shareholder, Li Yuan Zhang, but others who have significant finance experience or marketing or ESG. But and of course you don't want yes people. You want people who are going to challenge, who may disagree. We need to have healthy, robust debate. But as you say, you don't want a loose cannon who's going to be disruptive. We all need to respect one another's views, and together, collaboratively, come to a decision. So again, it's important to get that mix right, and I think we've got a great and extremely effective board.
Just on the CFO, this is a role that's more than just a functionary that adds up the numbers. What else should a CFO contribute?
Yes, I don't think probably Luke Shaw will be too flattered to hear that as his sort of job description. But of course, a CFO needs to be totally on top of the numbers and do and so Luke will do what is expected and what one would expect of a CFO from the many responsibilities. I mean, he effectively has, from the bottom up, the clerks on the estates through to the head of finance in Jakarta, the head of tax, feeding through to him, reporting through to him, and in the preparation of whether it's monthly management accounts, the interim reports, the annual report, in budget preparations, in project analysis, investment appraisal, many such functions. I've no doubt list out a whole heap of things just in respect of finance. But in addition to that, he wears, as we often do at MP Evans, other hats. For instance, he's the whistleblowing officer. So in the event of a grievance or complaint, he is the go-to person that people are directed to. And in addition to that, I mean, he and Matthew do devote a significant amount of time, particularly post-results, to speaking to the market, and Luke in particular to liaising with the analysts, the brokers who increasingly are interested in the story. I believe that in the last year or so that Matthew and Luke between them have had something like 50 or 60 or more presentations following the interim and then again the last annual results. So that in itself is a big role. And I mean, he and Matthew, they are the two executive directors in the group. They are the leadership team. And they, as we always have done at head office, work incredibly collaboratively together. And then I come in normally once a week and we chat through everything. And Luke gives me a rundown of how things have gone, as does Matthew. So, you know, it's a significant and extremely important role.
Yeah, it's very much a fuller role that you've described there. You're on the nominations committee. Have you always got half an eye on the future and refreshing the board?
Well, funnily enough, we don't have a nominations committee, and that's not because we don't attach importance to nominations. It's because we attach more importance to nominations than by having a separate committee. It is something that the whole board is interested in and is involved with. There is very often a subcommittee that will help to liaise with recruitment companies to, if you like, find a suitable number of shortlisted candidates. But from that point on, the board as a whole will be involved in interviewing those candidates. And every single board member will want to be, you know, happy that we are bringing somebody suitable on board, because it is so important to have a well-functioning board, as I just explained. And not only is the board very much interested and involved in nominations to the board, but also to the senior leadership roles, whether it's the role of president director or heads of department, and succession planning is a very critical part of board discussion, and there are papers presented on it because it is extremely important to know, who the key players are and who the key players are, if you like, in waiting.
Okay. Again, within a small group of people, is there ever a threat that board members retire or leave in quick succession? And has it ever occurred where you've been a little bit thin and exposed?
I don't recall us ever actually having been over exposed. Funnily enough, we've probably had more changes only because of natural retirements, because the end of a 9-year tenure has come up. So I think we've had some 4 changes since Philip's retirement from the board in 2023, but they've been well planned, and we have found extremely suitable replacements. Occasionally we've been caught unawares because somebody has had to leave for normally very good and understandable reasons at short notice, But I don't think there's a time when I could say that we were caught sort of exposed or thin on the ground.
Peter, I came up with this next question before I knew I was about to become a non-executive, but decided to leave it in. I've not been a non-exec director for 37 days, never mind 37 years. Very often, it's the non-execs rather than the executives that incur the criticism from shareholders. They're often portrayed as just sitting in a few meetings, giving some advice and collecting some soft money. And for those investors who remember Tiny Roland, he described them as baubles on a Christmas tree. It's a broad question, but what should a non-exec contribute and what level of commitment do you expect?
Well, Mark, I think that would be an extremely unfair description of the excellent role performed by our non-execs at MP Evans. Of course, they're not involved in the day-to-day operations, and that is, in a sense, the point. Theirs is to take, as appropriate, a more helicopter view of things, but also, where required, to dig more deeply into the detail. Their role is to hold the executives to account, indeed to hold me to account as chair, given that, especially that I am not deemed to be an independent chair, given my length of service and the fact that I previously served as an executive, and therefore the role of the senior independent director is a particularly important one. They need to ensure that we keep the business on track, that we deliver the strategy, that we run the business in an efficient and responsible fashion. But there's plenty of hard graft. I mean, those board packs that go out 6 times a year are pretty chunky. They're often up to 15 items or so. And indeed, for the March meeting, it will contain the draft annual report, which now, as gripping as it is, but now runs to about 100 pages. They will most of them will serve on both the audit committee and the remuneration committee, focusing on the sound financial controls and risk management, and on the remuneration committee, setting appropriate remuneration levels for the executives, and generally ensuring that good corporate governance is adhered to. There may be unscheduled meetings which we, and especially the executives, may ask them to attend at short notice if, for instance, there's a project, an investment decision, a discussion where it's going to be helpful to discuss matters at short notice. They also will wish to keep themselves informed generally about any significant developments in the business between board meetings, and indeed of any significant developments in the wider palm oil sector. And they may at times attend courses or webinars. And it's the executive's job to make sure that they are kept informed of developments of note. And again, there's plenty more I'm sure I could add to that list, but again, that gives some sense of the duties and the responsibilities of the non-executive directors. So Mark, good luck. I'm sure you're going to have your work cut out, and I'm sure you'll do an excellent job in your new role.
We often see non-execs with a portfolio of positions. Where do you stand on overboarding, where a director holds a number of positions simultaneously? And on that, regarding our 2 execs, Matthew and Luke, I believe we had their services exclusively. Is this mandatory?
Well, first of all, on recruiting new non-executive directors, we don't have a specific number, if you like, of other directorships that we would look at before saying, no, that's too many. But certainly, if there were more than 3 or 4, we would question very closely whether that prospective director would have the time in terms of potential diary clashes. I mean, we have 6 board meetings a year, and indeed a biannual trip every second year, which the entire board come on, which is happening shortly, actually, in October. So just from a practical perspective, it probably wouldn't be viable to have more than, say, three or four other board seats for our non-execs. And with regard to Matthew and Luke, it's not, I think, specifically excluded. It hasn't happened partly because they have such a busy role, both of them. I mean, obviously, there would, I suppose, be the potential advantage of gaining outside board experience of another business, another industry, but the offset against that is the danger of all of a sudden, well, not only diary clashes, but all of a sudden, for instance, an unexpected M&A coming up and then being calls on their time beyond what was previously expected. But maybe it's something that can be considered, but it hasn't happened to date.
Okay. Now, not a board member, but somebody who's a very close satellite and we see sat at the top table at the AGM is the company secretary. And this is very often a forgotten person, really, and it's a lot more than an inky-fingered clerk that you're reading a Dickens novel. Now, how important is this role, and what are some of the core duties?
Well, I really must try to persuade Katja to stop using that quill pen of hers and teach her how to use a computer. But no, in all seriousness, the role of the company secretary, and specifically our company secretary, Katja Merrick, is an extremely important one. Perhaps a little bit more, if you like, but behind the scenes, but nonetheless fulfilling a vital role, whether it's taking the minutes at the board meetings, writing the minutes, and that in itself is quite an art of sort of encapsulating the key points, but not giving every single last detail, but making sure that it is a clear reflection of what was discussed and agreed, preparing the board agendas, getting them all organised to be sent out in a timely fashion. The many other normal responsibilities that go with being a company secretary of a listed company. She will be in frequent touch with our nomad regarding any announcement that goes out that they would need to see and clear first. She will liaise with them. She's also, as a qualified lawyer, as many company secretaries are, I believe, these days, she will liaise with our corporate lawyers, Lovells, who we use, in perhaps drafting the appropriate sections in the corporate governance and the annual report, or with our own in-house legal team in Indonesia with regard to, for instance, the legal agreement in relation to a sale and purchase agreement in relation to a new investment. So there's a multitude of roles. Again, my list hasn't been exhaustive, but it just gives some flavour of the importance of the company secretary's role.
Yeah, it's another very, very important role. Now, so in terms of preparing for, chairing and managing the board meetings, how do you get the best out of these, Peter?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, it's important to make sure that the board papers go out in a timely fashion. So I'll liaise carefully with Katja and indeed Matthew on that. And the board meetings generally will last anywhere between 3, 4, 5, even up to 6 hours, depending sometimes on whether there are additional committee meetings, audit committee meetings, REMCO meetings. There might, as I said, be some 15 items on the agenda, so one has to get through them in a fashion which makes sure that you don't spend too long on any particular item, but you need to make sure that you get the best out of your board, that I get everybody who has something useful and meaningful to contribute to the discussion on a particular agenda item to speak. And sometimes when, for instance, two of our board members, the Asian-based two, who attend a minimum of 2 the board meetings in person. They will generally be online, and so it's important to ensure that they are absolutely as much involved and engaged in the discussion, particularly when there are items where I know they can make a helpful contribution, so that they're absolutely very much part and parcel of being round the table. I try not to dominate the discussion. It's more about making sure that everybody has their chance to speak, and giving them, fair crack of the whip to have their say. That generally does, I think, make for good and healthy debate, and help us to lead to some, good decisions which we've made over the past few years, particularly with all the expansion that's been taking place, and with increasing emphasis on, corporate governance, compliance, anti-bribery and corruption. All these things need to be discussed, reviewed by the board. So there's a lot to get through, and generally, I think we get through it in a reasonably effective and efficient way.
Yeah, hybrid meetings are more and more prevalent these days for different reasons. We're in a global world. A different type of meeting is the annual general meeting, and I've attended the last three MP Evans AGMs. Other companies, the attendance is often meagre, and some directors are dismissive, and the event is downright inhospitable. In contrast, MP Evans actively encourage attendance, which is always very good, and engagement with the shareholders is before and after the meeting, and the directors don't head for the door. Why do you actually actively promote the AGM, Peter?
Well, to me, I find it extraordinary that other companies don't do the same thing. I mean, the shareholders are a vitally important group of, as they say, stakeholders. They are the owners of the company. And if it was, say, just 5 or 10 owners, then of course you would keep them very fully informed. The fact that it might be closer to 1,000, to my mind, makes not a jot of difference. You need to nurture them, to make sure that they understand what you're doing, to present to them, and the AGM is a good forum at which to make a short presentation, which Matthew will do, as well as going through the usual sort of, if you like, ritual of the more formal part of the meeting. But then afterwards, it's a great opportunity to catch up with, particularly if you like, the smaller shareholders, the smaller retail investors, because the bigger shareholders, some of the institutional investors, we will have had a chance as the sort of executive, and plus myself sometimes, team, to meet up with the bigger shareholders and to explain what's been going on. But this is a chance for the retail investors to come, and we also have increasingly in recent years been making more of the annual results presentation to have the Investor Meet Company Forum presentation, where again we encourage our shareholders to attend online, and they have the opportunity to ask questions. And we absolutely welcome, encourage their involvement and their support. And in fact, of course, 2 years ago, when we celebrated 150 years of MP Evans's history, we stated in the annual report that every shareholder, it didn't matter how many shares, how few or how many they owned, was welcome to attend. It would be on a first come, first served basis, because there were actually only 220 seats available at the Mansion House for the lunch that followed the AGM. But as it transpired, 214 people attended, so we didn't need to turn back, if you like, turn away an application from a single shareholder, and I think that was very much appreciated.
Yeah, that event at the Mansion House was absolutely fantastic. But that aside, the Tello Chandler's Hall, where you generally hold the AGM, is another fantastic facility. And for any MP Evans shareholders out there, if you can possibly go, I would say I'll try and encourage them to attend the annual general meeting. I think it's a fantastic event. Given the company's long-term record of profits and increasing dividends, it's little surprise that there's a lot of goodwill between shareholders and the board. But have you ever experienced any hostile times, Peter?
Very seldom, which in a way is surprising, given that clearly it is a slightly, if you like, sensitive or controversial industry that we're in. I mean, we very much describe our ESG credentials and are at pains to do that. But you would have thought there might be people who come along and might object to the industry of palm oil, but that actually, touching wood firmly, has never happened. Sometimes the questioning can be maybe a little sharp, but generally it's very supportive. Sometimes we've had some slightly quirky questions. I remember one shareholder objected to the use of the term P. He wanted it that the dividend to be declared as a number of pence. That Queen's English should be properly used. And another shareholder, I remember when I think my father at the time was asking for a vote on the director's remuneration, and one shareholder who could be slightly sharp in his questioning stood up, and we all wondered what he was going to say, and he said, "Chairman, is it enough?" But I mean, I perhaps should mention the so-called hostile takeover bid, which took place in 2016, which actually our defence advisors later described as the most gentlemanly, or in a sense the most friendly of hostile takeover bids. But nonetheless, I think it was because of the level of understanding and support that our shareholders had, that despite the fact that our shares were trading at the time at around £4.20, that 87% of the shareholders rejected the initial offer at £6.40 and then again at £7.40. And I'd like to think that we've been vindicated in that, with the share price currently trading. Well, I believe today it's getting towards the all-time high of around £13.60. But of course things have moved on. We've always been friends with KLK, and they have chosen to come back and invest as a 24% shareholder, and we absolutely welcome that support, and we compare notes on all the aspects of the plantation sector. We're delighted to have Yuan's representation on the board, and I believe that they are very happy, long-term, significant minority shareholders. So there's been a very sort of happy outcome on both sides for that.
Well, for those shareholders that rejected the takeover, it certainly was a jam tomorrow story that came good. You joined the board in 1989, and you've seen significant change since then as the group has evolved and prospered. How does the current responsibility, excellence, growth and yield strategy reflect both the past and the future of MP Evans?
Yes, indeed, Reggie. And I think if I ever get a dog, I'll call him Reggie. But it's a slightly sort of trite-sounding acronym to describe the absolutely core strategic pillars and values to which we ascribe, which actually have, in a sense, always been there, or not always so formally, and probably more formally now in terms of the increasing emphasis on compliance. But we believe we've always been a responsible producer of whether it's palm oil or other commodities or crops. But we really are passionate about that, and that is our first and foremost, if you like, core value, which is about doing things right in a responsible way, which is why Matthew in particular devotes so much attention to this area, as I described earlier. And they all kind of link in one with the other, that we are responsible producers of sustainable palm oil, and we like to think that we do it in an excellent way. We aspire towards being increasingly excellent. There's always further improvements, but by providing the best housing, the best facilities, the fabulous clubhouses on our, particularly the more remote plantations, schools in some of those remoter plantations. We now have some 1,000 school places, and these are really top quality schools, so that we can encourage the best quality managers to stay with us, even if they're being posted to a reasonably remote plantation. They know that their children will get a good education. And then, of course, growth and yield. There's been an increasing emphasis on that in more recent years, I suppose since the formation of our strategy going back to 2005. In the past, it was my father's strategy was about preserving the security, the safety of the group, and if it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't have had a group to a platform, if you like, from which to launch ourselves. But growth and yield, continuing growth, bit by bit, expanding around our existing plantations, and giving better and better returns to shareholders by way of dividends, by way of share buybacks, adding to the existing land banks. This is something that we continually strive to do. So yes, Reggie is absolutely core to us.
Yeah. Right. Well, very shortly, Peter, Paul and I are going to ask you to go over to the other side of Ireland because we've got some oil palms growing, and we're going to ask you to show us how to harvest the fruit, please. But perhaps as one final question, is there one particular decision or achievement during your lengthy tenure at MP Evans of which you are most proud? And I'll just throw some. Please don't embarrass us by saying deciding to come on this podcast, please.
Oh, damn! Just what I was going to say. Well, Mark, I'd say there have been probably a handful of really significant decisions that I've been involved with, very much with the support of my colleagues over the years. I mean, clearly the one to go for it back in 2005 was a very, very important one. But I would say that the thing I'm probably most proud of is, with all the decisions made, and they haven't always been the right ones, but what we actually have today. Today in 2025, we have an extremely effective board. We have an excellent team in the UK. We have an excellent team in Jakarta and across the whole of Indonesia. And it's always a joy to visit any part of the company's operations, whether it's the Jakarta office or one of the plantations on the ground. And there's just this sort of buzz, which is wonderful, the enthusiasm. And in fact, Matthew and Luke recently attended a managers conference in just outside Jakarta, and they said there was a huge buzz, just in terms of people's support and loyalty, and just sense of enthusiasm for the business as a whole and going forward, and the plans going forward. So it's a real privilege to be part of that and have played some part in helping to establish it. So in the event that you were to whisk me away to that desert island of yours, I would feel very reassured. And I'm not planning to be whisked away in the short term, I can assure you. But if I were, then I would feel that I had left the group in extremely capable and safe hands.
Well, on that, Peter, can I just say a big thank you for joining us? We've enjoyed it. And perhaps if you have too, you could perhaps come and join us in another 37 years.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a huge pleasure. And a thank you to Paul for looking after the technical support. And yes, I would be delighted to, and I shall make a note in my brand new, as it turns out, electronic diary, which I'm just trying to get to grips with. So thank you very much.
Well, that's all for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember the content is for information only and it is not financial advice. If you have a question for Mark for our Question in a Bottle podcast, just complete the form on our website, thedesertislandinvestor.co.uk. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.